Hello, so this is the fourth video lecture on the chapter on culture, and we will proceed with the last video lecture. We ended talking about cultural, non-material cultural elements. Oh, that's a mouthful. Non-material cultural elements. And you should have found a couple activities, a couple assignments specific to those. One was specific about body language, and body language would certainly fall under the category of non-material cultural elements, specifically gestures. And the other one is about how people talk in different parts of the country. I think that one's kind of cool. That's one of the fun ones. Okay, and so this video is going to pick up and talk about a few other cultural concepts, specifically concepts related to, your textbook I think calls them cultural worlds, but it's the idea, so it's what terms like what we mean when we say dominant culture versus subculture versus counterculture, these kinds of things. So when we talk about when in sociology, when we use terms like dominant or majority, we are not referring to numbers, right? You'd be talking about that in, say, in math. We're talking about power. So when we talk about majority, we're not talking about the numerical majority, we're talking about the group that has the most power. The same thing would be true when we talk about dominant culture versus subdominant culture, because there certainly are instances in parts of the world, such as South Africa, where the dominant, the numerical, the majority of people were people who had less power, right? The dominant. So an example, going back to the triangle, the dominant culture would certainly be people at the bottom, because the numerical majority from that model, there would be more of them, but we would not consider them to be the dominant culture because they don't have the power. So the dominant culture is the one that sort of influences all the others, right? It's the one that has the most influence. And I think it's fair to say that in the American culture, it's wealth that would be considered dominate. So it is something, the idea of wealthy people influences all the ambitions of all the others, right? That at least that would be typical. I can't say I necessarily agree with that for me personally, but I think it's a fair assumption that it's the values of wealth and material comfort, that those are considered the dominant cultural values, even though they may not be values that the poorest of the poor people can live by. Subcultures would be groups within groups. Of my favorite subculture that I actually assign you a video to watch, and you'll hear me refer to them a lot, is the Amish. I just think the Amish are really cool, and they are a culture within the larger American capitalist, Christian, competitive, dominant culture. Within that culture, there is a group who does not share those values, who doesn't share the value in competition or or complexity, but they live a very simple life. They are capitalists, right? Actually, Amish people are quite wealthy. Matter of fact, they're so wealthy that in some parts of eastern United States, they have driven up farming prices, and non-Amish people can't afford to pay those prices. So they are capitalists, but they do not accumulate bling. They don't like to accumulate stuff. They live simply. They don't believe in competition. They don't participate in the military, these kinds of things. So subcultures would be defined as a group within a larger culture. And again, I use a fairly broad concept of culture, and I think you could take you could call all students a culture, maybe the dominant culture, and within that you might have the business students, or you might have the nursing students, or you might have, the diesel mechanic students. So you can have little groups within a larger group, right? So you could maybe say, you know, and again, these ideas can be applied to patterns in a variety of different ways, but you could say football fans might be the larger culture, but within that you have the subculture of Packers fans or the subculture of Chiefs fans. So that's sort of what that means. Maybe family life could be the dominant culture, but you have the children, the way they do things. So it's this idea. And sometimes there's some confusion. There's actually some disagreement about what the concept of counterculture means. Um, Counterculture is traditionally thought of, I mean, by its strictest definition, a counterculture is a culture that does something an opposite, contrary to, right? So probably the one that comes to people might come to your mind are gang members, that they do something an opposite to. Well, there is one way of thinking about that, and I think it's a TED Talk I used to assign many years ago, and he describes how gangs are very similar to McDonald's and his metaphor and families. That the argument is that in the purest form, a counterculture has nothing similar to the dominant culture, but one can think about gangs in that they have a very formalized structure of hierarchy, kind of like the military does, kind of like other organizations do. Loyalty is very important. In some family cultures, loyalty is very important. That the lowest level people do the front work, right? So kind of like McDonald's, you have the lowest paid worker who's the one standing at the register. You have the one that has the most power and the most authority. And sometimes they're the district manager and you don't even know what they look like. Kind of like gangs, right? That the more powerful organized crime leaders are further away from the front line. So, you know, I mean, typically you would think of the definition of a counterculture is that they do something in opposition. So if you're defining gangs as countercultures because they break the law, okay, but if you're suggesting that they organize themselves because they're doing something that's so radically different than any other social group, I don't think it meets that category, because gangs actually do things that are really consistent, that are very much similar to other subgroups. A pluralist society, this word sometimes gets interchanged with the term multicultural society, and those do not mean the same thing. The idea of a pluralist society is one in which you have lots of different cultures and they're all in here together, right? And that they're treated equally. And most social scholars argue we don't got that. We don't have a true, you know, that's the metaphor of the melting pot. They say we don't have a melting pot. We really have more like a salad bowl, right? We've got lots of different ingredients. They all get mixed up, but every time you take a bite, you'll get like maybe cheese and a crouton. And the next time you'll get a bite, you'll get like an olive and a piece of lettuce. It's not all equal. Like the same way with the salad, you'll have some pieces fall to the bottom and other pieces stay at the top. Not every group is equally regarded, not has equal sort of opportunities, but the idea of a pluralist society. Okay. This next slide here is actually about values and norm. I mean, it's about cultural values, but I'm going to stop here and wrap up this little lecture. And when I come back, I want to talk about value cultures and value contradictions or value clusters.